Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Rosalind Russo, Live Conference Committee Chair this year and a member of the IFOA Sustainability Board. It's my absolute pleasure to be chairing this webinar today, particularly as it is the first event in the IFOA's latest thought leadership webinar series, The Road to Egypt, focusing on sustainability and climate issues. As part of this series, the IFOA will be hosting 4 webinars, which will seek to move the debate forward on the themes discussed in the last series, looking at COP26 in Glasgow. Today's event will take a deep dive into the challenges most relevant to the host continent of COP27, and future events in the series will provide an overview of the key investment debates around net zero, a recap of the main commitments agreed around biodiversity at COP15 in Montreal in December, and a session which will be led by the Sustainability Board's Early Careers Board. Please do sign up for these events through the IFOA's event page. Through the series, we will provide a platform for prominent contributions within our own thought leadership community so that our members and others can understand the perspectives of a very wide range of parties. And you'll also be able to rewatch the full video recording on demand via the IFOA's virtual learning environment and our YouTube channel. So today's webinar questions: what does Africa need from COP27? Now, while climate change is global, Africa is disproportionately vulnerable to its effects. The continent has contributed negligibly to the changing climate, with only around 2 to 3% of global emissions, yet it stands out disproportionately as the most vulnerable region in the world, driven by the prevailing low levels of socioeconomic growth in the continent. With COP27 taking place in Egypt this year, this webinar will focus in on what African nations need from the deliberations. It will look at some of the specific challenges facing the host continent and how actuaries are responding to them. It will seek to answer questions such as: which climate threats are unique to African nations? What are the potential consequences? What are the latest developments or initiatives aimed at addressing the climate crisis on the continent? And finally, what are actuaries doing on the ground in Africa to help? So to help us answer these questions, we've assembled an expert panel. So joining us today are Elias Omondi, Lucy Nondi, and Liz Booth. Elias leads the development and implementation of the programs that work to improve the enabling environment for risk markets in Africa to drive systematic change in the market for insurance and other risk management instruments. Elias has assisted various countries in Asia, Africa, and Caribbean, especially insurance and pension supervisors, to establish regimes of risk-based supervision. He has also supported market innovation, designing and testing innovative mechanisms of risk management through the formulation of the Regulatory Sandbox and InsurTech Accelerator platform, BIMA-Lab. He is chair of ESG Africa Task Force and currently serves as Senior Manager, Risk Regulations within FSD Africa. Our next panelist is Lucy Nondi. She's a qualified actuary and has experience in InsurTech, regulation and compliance within the insurance industry. She currently works as an assistant actuarial manager at Jubilee Insurance Company of Kenya, where she is in charge of pricing, valuation, and supports IFRS 17 implementation. She has previously worked as an actuarial officer in the Insurance Regulatory Authority of Kenya and as a lead business analyst at Turnkey Africa, a company that provides software solutions to insurance companies across the African continent. She holds a master's degree in actuarial management from City, University of London, and a BSc degree in actuarial science from the University of Nairobi. She is passionate about ESG and is a founding member of the ESG Africa Task Force, created by the Actuarial Society of Kenya and FSD Africa to drive and support readiness of the financial sector in managing ESG risks and in supporting green finance. And our final panelist is Liz Booth, who is the managing editor of Africa Ahead, the Sustainability Challenge, a publishing house specializing in the delivery of targeted newsletters to niche sectors of global industries. To date, it is focused on the insurance and risk management categories, providing key information, the latest news and analysis through regular news feeds and supporting websites, bringing vital intelligence to that community. Liz has worked for a range of insurance and marine titles, including as contributing editor of the Chartered Insurance Institute Journal, as former news editor of Insurance Day, editor for Maritime Risk International, and editor of Commercial Risk Africa. Africa Ahead was founded in 2019 as a fortnightly newsletter and boasts a readership of around 4,500 readers. Africa Ahead is a signatory to the Nairobi Declaration on Sustainable Insurance and gives back to the industry through mentoring young insurance journalists across the continent, which I think is wonderful. So before I hand over to our panelists for their opening remarks, I just wanted to remind all attendees that if you have any questions throughout the session, please put these in the Q&A box, and we will be answering as many of these as possible during our Q&A section at the end. So I'd like to hand over to Elias for his opening remarks.
All right, thank you very much. And it's great to be here at this part of the day across the continent and also across the world. And it's a great honor to be part of this great discussion. You know, as you've mentioned, Africa is facing a lot of challenges, particularly when it comes to issues of climate, but also the biodiversity loss. And it is a privilege that this year COP27 is being held in Africa. And one of the key things that most of people are talking about in the African continent, that this COP should be an implementation COP. And if you look at that, then you look at a continent that is highly exposed to a number of risks. In this case, we've seen drought really ravaging the African continent. We've also experienced quite a number of areas flooding. The most recently, you know, if you've watched the news, you've seen the flooding in Nigeria really causing a lot of havoc in that particular country. And these are some of the key elements that really show us that the world is really precedented with a lot of challenges that are highly connected to the climate-related issues. Now, with that, then we need also to look at how this presents to us an opportunity. So the African continent presents a massive investment opportunities, particularly for investors that want to advance in terms of creating climate solutions. And that's why at COP27, one of the key things that we'll be talking about is how then do we create these particular solutions. We all aware that a low carbon and resilient pathway offers an opportunity for African continent to address the climate change issues, at the same time ensuring that there's sustainable development and improvement of livelihoods within the continent. If you look at some of the statistics, you'll be able to recognize that in terms of the insurance penetration in the entire continent is still below 3%. We talk about 2.78% as the level of penetration in Africa. That means that so many people are still exposed to risks because in one or the other, they don't really have access to solutions of risk management infrastructure within the continent. At the same time, the exposure really give them no other opportunity to protect themselves against this risk. Basically, also, it's important to say that there are a number of resources that also we need to tap in when it comes to creating these pathways for resilience and low carbon economies in Africa. Particularly, how then do we tap into private and also the public sector to speed up and scale some of the solutions that will need to be made available to this particular continent. Also, just to mention, we need also to look at physical and also economic environment, because in terms of the infrastructure within the continent, there are still a number of key components that need to be addressed. So when we talk about the economies, do we have enough regulations to support this particular transition? Do we have even the skills necessary to enable us to get the continent towards a low carbon, but also a more resilient economies within this continent? Also, we've seen a number of key components whereby we have seen a number of countries really need to foster a number of sectoral policies. We need to think about the taxonomies that needs to be developed in these particular countries. At the same time, there is need to kind of look at mechanisms that will attract both domestic and international resources and investors towards putting capital to support the continent in terms of the exposure that the continent is currently facing. If you look at the continent, we usually say over 70% of the economy is driven by risks that are related to issues around climate, but also nature. So Africa is highly dependent on climate, so that if you look at components such as agriculture, most of the agricultural produce are rain-fed. At the same time, in terms of other critical areas that do drive the economic outlook of Africa is highly nature-based. And within that, then it basically means that the continent is highly exposed because, as Rosalie had mentioned earlier, in terms of the contribution to the risks, but also the effects that the African continent is experiencing, they are not the highest contributors to the emissions, but at the same time, the African continent is a highly exposed continent within the world. Now, 30 out of 40 most vulnerable countries in the continent are in Africa. So if you look at that, then you kind of see the magnitude of the exposure that this continent really is experiencing when it comes to the issues of climate change. We've also seen issues around energy, which is a key component that really impacts the continent, but also just to balance that along with the development that Africa needs. Africa has not really exhausted the resources that would enable it develop in terms of what we've seen from the countries on the north, because most of the developments are highly processed through emitting resources within those particular countries. Maybe just to mention a few barriers that we've kind of experienced, and we'll be able to dedicate much more as we get into these panel discussions. We believe that Africa needs to build a very coherent financial infrastructure that basically looks at green economies, because without Africa really building and breaking these particular barriers that are highly making it exposed to these particular risks, then we will not be able to address the future of this particular continent. Also, we need to look at how then Africa needs to be compensated, because in terms of the emissions, they're not the highest emitters, but the consequences that really is putting Africa at a highest level of exposure is dependent on other countries. So we need to look at how then do we ensure that there is need to critically invest in opportunities that will make Africa more resilient, at the same time provide a pathway for the African future. So there are various acute issues that need to be addressed, and we believe that as we head up to COP27, some of these issues will be clearly discussed and make sure that when what we are going to see at COP27 will be an implementation COP, whereby Africa will be able to get the rightful value of the exposure that it has been put towards, but at the same time create an opportunity for various investors across the world to come in and invest to address these particular challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elias. Lucy, would you like to share your opening thoughts with us, please?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Rosalind. Maybe you can confirm that you can hear me. Okay, yeah. So thank you. I think that was a very good insight, or very, very good insights from Elias. And I think for me, what I can just say that we've seen companies around the world embarking on their ESG journey towards sustainability, social acceptance, and good governance. But the African continent is still playing catch up with just a few companies who basically have a global presence working towards their ESG reporting. And as Elias has rightly put it, we've seen that studies have shown that the African continent is going to be greatly impacted by the effects of climate change. A report basically from ESI Africa has shown that like in 2020-2021 year, we saw that there were approximately 131 weather-related events or calamities that have led to so many issues or things to do with food insecurity, displacement of people, and also death of many people. We've seen things, events such as flood, locust infestations, drought, as Elias has put it, and we've seen that they've really impacted our economy, because you've seen in Africa, most African countries tend to rely on agriculture as the backbone of their economies. So with such statistics staring in our faces, we need to, the government, private, non-private organization, as well as the Africans need to reflect on our future and this particular continent, and how we can benefit from this year's COP27, which is just going to be held within this continent. So in as much as we've had such statistics, we've also seen several steps being put in place to ensure ESG issues are addressed. In as much as we are not really there when it comes to sustainability, we've seen so many countries, other African countries, being receptive when it comes to going green initiatives, as well as climate finance implementation or climate change committees being put in place to just ensure that our future looks towards looks forward to a sustainability journey, as well as improvement of livelihoods and also development of infrastructure. So a good example is here in Kenya, where we have our very own Nairobi Declaration that was established to frame long-term environmental strategies for achieving sustainable development. I think this declaration was has been established close to 30 years ago, and we've seen various firms, especially within the financial space, such as our very own regulator, insurance companies here in Kenya, coming together to offer the support to promote this great initiative. And we've also seen in other African countries, such as South Africa, financial regulators being receptive to going green in sustainability issues. For instance, we've seen FSP Africa signing an MOU with the Egyptian Financial Regulatory Authority to help the country's financial sector to become more sustainable. In addition, we've also seen a rise in the number of sustainable bonds that have been issued in South Africa. Also here in Kenya, we've had a green bond that we initially issued. It was even sort of like overpriced, and it really did well within the market. So basically, just this shows that Africa is very receptive and it's open towards sustainability and other issues to do with social acceptance and good governance. And I believe that this discussion, or the discussion we're going to have here, will really be a great, let me not say starting point, but a continuous discussion to what is actually happening within the space. And it's going to be actually a good forum as we gear towards next week's event that is going to be held in Egypt. So thank you, and back to you, Rosalind.
Thank you, Lucy. And finally, over to you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Ros. As you've explained, I'm managing editor of Africa Ahead, the Sustainability Challenge. So I'm really going to be reflecting on what I hear from much better informed people than me, and we've already heard a little from just two of those. However, I'm also on the steering committee of the Nairobi Declaration on Sustainable Insurance, which has become a truly Pan-African movement since it was established in April 2021, and it now has about 80 insurance entity signatories from some 25 countries across the continent. Obviously we're hoping that that number is going to continue growing in the coming weeks. What we see in the declaration is a group of people who are committed to the sustainability agenda, but who are at very different stages of the journey. They're not ready in all cases to sign up to the UN Principles for Sustainable Insurance, for example, because it demands things that they cannot do. But what I mean often by that is that they're following the principles, but not documenting them in the right way, or they're not structuring them accordingly. So the desire to undertake their ESG journey is definitely there. They also want to work within an African framework, delivering solutions that are workable in an African context. And that means different things in 54 different countries. So whatever happens next, it's got to be flexible, and it's got to acknowledge those huge differences across the continent. So for me, the key to COP27 really stems from COP26. In Glasgow, there were a lot of promises made about helping emerging markets to transition, but not all of that financial support has materialized, and I really think it needs to. I think that COP27 needs to be about actions and not just words, really echoing what Elias has said. And I think the promises of COP26 also need to be delivered and added to. But above all, I think there needs to be some empathy. It's all very well for the global north to demand change, but they have taken advantage of Africa's resource wealth for decades, if not centuries. And now to impose any kind of punitive approach, which might impact emerging economies, but also very directly impacts the lives of millions of people, it can't be right. I don't think it can be right. There needs to be balance. I think COP27 needs to be the forum at which Africa's collective voice is heard. There needs to be material support to fund widespread infrastructure development. I talk and write about insurance and sustainability. Insurance will be playing a large part in enabling any changes wrought by COP27. I know key African insurance players will be physically at the event, and I'm really hoping that there's an opportunity for their voices to be heard and to be properly listened to. So thank you, Rosalind, back to you.
Thank you so much, Liz. So I'd like to now open some questions, or propose some questions to our panel. And I'll start with you, Elias, if I may. So what is the climate finance gap in Africa?
Yeah, thank you, Rose, and that's a very important question, because I did mention a number of challenges, and my colleagues have kind of gone further to explain the challenges that the continent is facing. So, for instance, if you look at our continent, Africa is highly exposed to risks, as I mentioned earlier, climate-related risks, issues around biodiversity loss, and if you look at the report that was issued some time back by the African Climate Policy, it calculated that the increase of global temperatures by just 1 degree Celsius would lead to a 2% loss in terms of the Africa's gross domestic product, in terms of GDP. And even further, it is mentioned that if would increase the temperatures, global temperatures, by around 4%, it will mean that Africa's GDP will contract by 12%. So that basically shows you the level of exposure the continent is currently facing. Even further than that, it's mentioned that if climate change is not really addressed by the year 2050, around 30% of African GDP would have been lost. And that basically means that that is what Africa is highly dependent on. Then if you look at the financing gap, and that is where we will need to put a lot of conversations when we are going to have the discussions at COP27. It is estimated that the continent needs around $277 billion annually to implement its NDCs. And that basically means that if in that case, then how much money does Africa have to implement some of these NDCs that were signed in Paris Agreement? It estimated that Africa only has around 29.5 billion. So that gives you a clear indication that Africa only has around 10% to start to support itself towards this clearly glooming exposure that climate change is going to address. So that basically means that there's a big gap for Africa to really close this financing gap. And that basically means that there is a lot of opportunities that also as a continent, we need to see how then we address this particular gap that we are currently facing. Now, there are a number of initiatives that have been initiated by different companies and also institutions that are across the world. And that is basically to ensure that we start addressing these particular challenges. If you look at the African budgets, particularly different governments, they might not really have adequate resources to start covering some of these particular risks. Maybe just to further into some of these particular challenges, if you look at the continent and only look at maybe, for instance, North Africa. North Africa, in terms of the climate financing and the climate investment gap, they have the lowest gap, whereby we talk about 3%. But if you move to the Central African countries and the East African countries, they have the largest climate investment gap. So for instance, the Central African countries, we talk about 26% of the GDP in terms of the average. And in terms of the Eastern African countries, talk around 23%. So these are quite alarming figures. That basically means that there's a gap that needs to be closed. There is opportunities that different organizations can take up and address, because without really addressing these particular issues, then we might get a continent that will be extinct maybe in the next couple of years. And the other thing is that for us as actuaries, this basically presents opportunities, because even in terms of developing the models to support in financing these particular gaps, really looking at data that will support in creating sustainable solutions across Africa, but also just ensuring that these particular solutions that are being created are well priced in terms of really looking at how the risk transfer mechanisms are developed to ensure that those particular assets are protected. So there's a lot of opportunity for various players in terms of investors coming in to close the gap, but also creating products and solutions that support the continent is an area that should highly be advocated and well addressed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elias. That makes perfect sense. My next question is for Lucy. So I believe some might say that Africa is quite far when it comes to infrastructure development, but in your opinion, will the incorporation of ESG practices fast track this development?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Rosalind, for that. And I believe so. I believe that by incorporating ESG practices, we'll be able to fast track infrastructure development. Just like Elias has said, if you look at, if you break down Africa into the various regions, and he's actually highlighted that within Central and East Africa, we have a very high climate investment gap. And therefore, this basically means that we have so many untapped opportunities that we can be able to sort of incorporate our different organizations to be able to achieve this particular development, or even just bridge this gap. So I think one of the ways you can be able to do this, as we've seen, there are so many solar energy projects that have been done, especially in Zambia. You see that there've been high production of solar energy to sort of substitute the reliance of power supply or electricity energy of hydropower. So we can see that African countries are receptive, even the government is receptive when it comes to adopting other renewable sources of energy, and therefore this will be able to sort of improve our power supply. If you look at the statistics, you've seen that there is, I'd say, steady and adequate, not really adequate, but the power supply within the urban regions are better compared to power supply in rural regions. And therefore, we've seen this presents an opportunity of using other forms of renewable energy, and I've already mentioned solar energy. We also have the biogas, which is also going to be a very good alternative when it comes to electricity supply, because first of all, the product used to produce biogas is, let me not say readily available, but if you look at rural areas, and they tend to practice a lot of livestock farming as well as crop farming, you find that product, the animal waste, is readily available, and it can be used to sort of produce It can be used to produce biogas energy, which can be used as an alternative energy, sort of light to produce, can be used for cooking, lighting, as well as an organic fertilizer. So we can see that this will be one of the gaps that you can be able to tap into, and as well as provide as a solution. We've also seen great strides being done in wind power. Here in Kenya, we had the Turkana Wind Power Project, and despite its challenges, we saw that the government was able to also use this when it comes to using it as an alternative source of electricity, and it was able to sort of give the rural people, or the people who are living around that region, a steady power supply. So there are great challenges, of course, when it comes to having other alternative sources of energy towards infrastructure development. One of them, of course, has to be high cost of installation. But with government support and subsidies, and as Elias put it, with also funding being given by developed countries, we can be able to see this being one of the greatest form of bridging the gap when it comes to infrastructure development. So I believe that this will occur. We've seen that infrastructure development has occurred at a faster pace compared to maybe 30 years ago, where we saw that, of course, due to lack of good technology compared to right now, we've seen that, and this has really grown. And also in the future, and maybe this can also be discussed in COP27, we'll see that maybe in 10 years to come, we'll see there's a growth when it comes to the use of renewable energy. So yeah, I believe that this will help incorporate, or rather fast track, the infrastructure development. Thank you.
Fascinating, Lucy. So my next question is for Liz. Now, Liz, I might be mistaken, but I believe you mentioned the NDSI Steering Committee. What is that doing?
Thank you. Yes, I did indeed. The Nairobi Declaration on Sustainable Insurance. The African Insurance Institute collectively has been working on climate-related insurance products, and the Nairobi Declaration has effectively brought together a like-minded group of professional insurance entities who really want to see products develop and for them to be a success and to be sustainable. So quite an ask. The key driver for the declaration has always been to give the African insurance market a proper voice in that global ESG conversation. You know, as we know, insurance is an enabler for most activities, and it does need to be considered at an earlier stage in the many conversations about funding, including those at COP27. How often have we heard about developments? I mean, I remember back in the day, there was a talk about a new railway line in Ghana, and nobody had considered the insurance implications of the project. And then they added it on, and it was almost kind of too late, you know. So insurance just needs to be discussed much earlier on. But in the kind of COP27 context, there has been this growing concern that the global north is somehow dictating what insurers can and cannot do on the continent and with their own businesses. And you know, we've seen some very reactionary phrases around this. On, you know, if you read sort of LinkedIn, for example, you'll hear people talking about ESG as being the new form of colonialism. Now, that's extreme, and I don't think people really truly believe that, but it's an indication of the disparate voices that have to be brought together and addressed. So the declaration has been something that African insurance entities can really rally around and provide a united voice of people who actually really do want to engage with the ESG conversation. They're not those extremists. But the other thing is that we need to stress is that declaration is really designed to be as simple as possible and not demand measurements or matrix from its signatories, but really asking for a commitment to consider ESG in all their business activities. Some see it very much as a stepping stone to signing the UN PSI, but others don't. They think they can go so far, but not all the way. So the steering committee has been set up to support the signatories. As I say, there's about 85 at the moment, and we really hope that number will grow a lot in the coming months. One of the things the committee will be doing is creating a taxonomy for ESG in an African insurance context. You know, what language do we use? What language do we put into our insurance clauses? Developing guidelines for those starting out on an ES journey. As we all know, often the hardest thing to do is to start. Once you start, you're fine, but how do you physically start? And also developing a communication plan so we can spread the word effectively amongst the signatories, but also importantly to the wider insurance community, and to explain the aims of the declaration to the general public, to government, to funders, etc. Several of the signatories are going to be at COP27, represented by their CEOs, and also several of the steering committee members will be there. I'm very envious because they've got lots of events and meetings planned, and I'm sure it's going to be a very exciting time.
Thanks, Liz. Excuse me. So I just want to remind our attendees that if you do have any questions for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A section, which should be at the bottom of your screen. But in the meantime, I'd like to ask Elias, who and what role can the key actors play in unlocking climate finance in Africa, especially given that there's such a gap that you highlighted earlier?
Yeah, so there are various players, and basically when we talk about the role that we need to play, it starts with everybody that sits in the continent. So, you know, in Africa, there are two conflicting objectives that we need to think about. We talk about climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and all that requires a level of attention to support towards creating the right pathways, particularly towards resilience within the continent. So there are various players and various actors that needs to come in to finance this particular gap. And just to mention even what my colleagues have just stated, those are some of the initiatives that have already started. For instance, you know, Nairobi Declaration, which basically is spearheaded by the organization that I work for, FSD Africa, has really, we are really trying to see how then we can start these particular conversations and start implementing at a very small scale initially, but currently create an impactful component that will be able to transform Africa. So there are a number of actors that need to come in, and the first actor that maybe we can talk about are the domestic governments, because you know governments ultimately, if these particular risks are not addressed, that will basically mean that there will be a next level stress to the domestic governments. And what we foresee is that the governments need to start thinking about fiscal policies and even spending to national decarbonization priorities. How then does the government really look at ways in which they can start thinking about decarbonization across the continent, but also importantly is developing policies and developing regulations to better align towards domestic financial sector to climate positive outcomes. And that is something that we've seen particularly in different countries in Africa. So for instance, I can give an example of Kenya. The Kenyan government has gone ahead and developed a green strategy, implementation strategy that looks into really creating a green economy, making Kenya to be a green economy in the next couple of years. Also, further than that, we've seen different support mechanisms, really trying to see how then this creation of green projects across different countries in Africa, particularly in Kenya. Also, the African Development Bank has gone ahead to develop a green belt movement, basically creating an ecosystem across the Congo region towards basically planting a number of trees to support Africa towards a green economy. The other another actor that will be particularly important are development partners, and when you look at that, that is some of the roles that some organizations such as ours do in terms of how then do we support underfunded projects, how then do we support technologies, how then do we support innovations, because that basically means that there is need to support innovators that are going to close this gap. Further than that, then there are issues around looking at different strategies to support this financing. So for instance, we've supported countries such as Nigeria and Kenya towards development of green bonds, and even further in Tanzania, we've gone ahead and supported creation of social bonds such as gender bonds to look at how then Africa realigns its portfolio. Other than that, then there are other sector players that need to come in, particularly importantly, the private sector, and the private sector can leverage in terms of creating financing vehicles, because that is something that Africa really needs. How do we create vehicles that will better match investment opportunities and basically give right returns towards some of these new instruments that are going to be developed? At the same time, then we've seen different sector players trying to become more, basically trying to create products that will support the ecosystem, and this will be the greatest driver towards creating a more sustainable economies in the future. So there are various, we have various actors that need to come in, and the key thing that we need to ensure is that as we create methodologies towards mitigation, we also enable Africa to adapt towards its solutions. Now, in terms of all these components around financing this gap, it might need a very proportionate but also fit for purpose solutions. You know, Africa might not really transform at once. There is need to look at how then we create very impactful but also fit for purpose solutions for Africa. This means that there's need to relook at the policies that are going to be created. There's need to look at the products that are going to be created. There's need to look at these particular investments and basically connect these particular investments with the rightful ecosystems within the continent. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we really need to come in as different players, different professional bodies, because even as actuaries, you know, we've been given an opportunity to support in terms of really computing that risk and enabling and providing insights to what will really happen in the future, but at the same time providing the right prices toward these new instruments that are looking into transforming the continent. So we have a lot of work to do, but we need to start now, and that's the conversation that we'll be having at COP27, that there are initiatives that have already started. We need to bring more initiatives into the play to create the rightful scale and impact within the continent.
Thanks, Elias. I love what you said there about methodologies towards mitigation. I think that's really powerful. And it also kind of leads me nicely into the next question I have for Lucy. So it's not necessarily the easiest question, but it echoes Elias's comments on actuaries and the contribution we can have. So Lucy, what is your opinion in how actuaries can contribute towards the promises that were made in COP26?
Thank you. Yeah, as you said, it's not really an easy question as well as an easy task. But if you can just look at some of the promises, some of the pacts that were made in COP26, that is at Glasgow, I think you'll have one of them was to reduce global temperatures to 1.5 degrees in terms of global warming or temperatures, and through maybe net zero carbon emissions. Another maybe agreement was to phase down the use of coal, which is a very big contributor towards fossil fuel emissions. Finally, you also have something to do with decarbonization of the transport sector as a whole. So I believe that we as actuaries have an invaluable expertise and resources to address some of these challenges, as well as some of these promises that were made in the last that is COP26. And maybe if I can just break down into some of the day-to-day activities that we tend to do. One of them is, as Elias had initially mentioned in his statement, we have underwriting and pricing of new products. So we've seen the issue of climate change related events such as drought and let's say locust infestation has really impacted our agriculture. And we've seen actuaries pricing or offering solutions when it comes to agriculture insurance, whereby it's basically here in Kenya or even in Africa, we've seen most companies or most insurance targeting small-scale farmers in order to provide them agricultural insurance, and whereby the payout is based on the yield, as well as the amount of rainfall that is received within a particular region. So those are some of the solutions that have been given here and that are suitable within the African continent. If you look at, let's say, other forms of parametric insurance, such as wind farm insurance, we've seen it being a great and reliable sort of type of insurance as the government is moving towards this form of renewable energy. And therefore, companies can be able to sort of identify this risk and be able to correctly price so that you can be able to have such solutions and can be able to also encourage sort of like wind farmers or wind farm companies to be able to provide these solutions in the future. Lastly, you can look at bioinsurance, which can sort of like provide cover or cushion against producers of biofertilizers. And as you can see here, as a result of the COVID-19, as well as the current war that is being impacted in Ukraine, we've seen the price of fertilizers increasing significantly. Like here in Kenya, it has really doubled. And we can see that organic fertilizers have really taken shape when it comes to farming and agriculture. And so insurance can be able to tap into this market and offer such solutions so that you can be able to sort of like promote the use of renewable energy and therefore achieve the 1.5 degrees temperature target by sort of 2030 and 2050 as promised by most countries, not only in Africa, but as well as the world. Second, if you look at investment and capital management, like in Europe, some companies have been required to disclose their climate-related risks within their regulatory reports that they usually submit to their regulators. And actuaries will be heavily involved in this sector, whereby they need to integrate sustainability risks in their risk management reporting. In Solvency II, we have the section called On Risk Solvency Assessment, where it looks at stress testing and scenario testing of companies' risks. And I believe that that's where maybe climate-related risks are going to fall under currently. And actuaries can be able to sort of give their expertise when it comes to this, and provide the way forward when it comes to advisory level, both either at the internal and at the external level when it comes to the insurance markets. We've also seen, as we have the ORSA in the Solvency II, we find that this can also be achieved when it comes to the African continent with some regulators, of course, like in South Africa, requiring companies to also disclose their ESG reporting when it comes to their investment as well as capital management. So this shows that as actuaries, you can be able to sort of give our own view and our expertise. And finally, even in the pension industry, I think this is one of the industry that also actuaries have dwelled in and rather are really have dominated in. And we've seen also in Africa that some pension funds and the social security funds have developed ESG scorecards, of which actuaries can be able to give their advice on this. And these scorecards are used to help in the investment making decisions, and this as well as in various financial sectors. So actuaries can be able to sort of assist in developing this ESG risk and incorporate them in companies or the pension fund risk management system, so that you can be able to ensure that such risks are identified and mitigated, not only in the current investment portfolio that these investment funds or other investment funds have, but also in the future investment strategies that are going to happen. And finally, maybe I'd say than our day-to-day, and I know most actuaries are usually well conversant when it comes to spreadsheets and Excel. We can also sort of involve ourselves in companies' CSR, that is corporate social responsibility. Just like Elia said, we've seen people planting trees along in Congo, and so we can be able to sort of participate in such events in the respective companies that you work in, so that it's not only at the spreadsheet level or at the advisory level, but also have a direct impact when it comes to going green. So I believe these are some of the sectors or areas that actuaries can be able to dwell in addition to the CSR engagements. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. So I can see we've got a comment in the Q&A, which I'll share shortly. But just before I do, Liz, I just wanted to ask you could you briefly touch on or give us any feedback on what signatories need to develop further in terms of their ESG journey?
Of course, yes. I'll be brief though, because I know we have got questions and we want to do that. Last week we held a workshop. We had Dorothy Maseka from ICA Lion, who's actually going to be speaking at COP27 next week. And we had Kaz Hanser, who was formerly with Continental Reinsurance. They led the way and were discussing how firms should think about ESG and start on their journeys internally. So as part of that, we asked some poll questions. Just to give you a flavour of the results, I'm not going to bore you with the whole detail, but it was quite interesting to see where people felt that, how did they start on this? A lot of this has been driven by boards across the continent, but about 50% of those who responded to the survey actually said it was someone who was passionate about ESG within the firm who's driven the conversation. And that's not necessarily a board member. They've just taken it on themselves, introduced it to the board, and then driven it forward. The answers that I think are really relevant to today's conversation and really lead on neatly from what Lucy has just been saying is that almost overwhelmingly, they all believe that regulators are going to ask them to take ESG more seriously, and they're going to want to see evidence of that. And obviously that's where the actuaries really can play a role. And secondly, 100% of those surveyed said that they think that in the future, investors will want to see evidence that they're taking ESG seriously. So everyone is very alive to the fact that there's going to be a very key role for their actuaries to evidence this on their behalf. The final point that I would make is that signatories also want help. They're keen to do the right thing, but not all of them are entirely sure of what's expected of them. And I think, again, this kind of conversation where actuaries can kind of learn from each other is vital. And I think at COP27, people are going to be looking for more of that. They don't want to be dictated to, but they would like that knowledge shared so that they can move on too. So back to you.
Thanks, Liz. So thank you, Makami, for sharing your comments and your thoughts. So just to share it with all attendees, Makami thanks the panelists, and she thinks we are on the right track, having created a joint movement on the African continent. And she says the point on equipping organizations to walk the talk is a great one, but she is concerned about potential greenwashing and blue washing, so that measuring the actual impact is a key risk from her perspective. So we do have about 5 minutes if you guys want to touch on Makami's point. I'll pass over to whoever would like to maybe add to what she's said.
Ros, if I can start the conversation rolling very quickly, I'll hand over to you, Elias. But I spend an awful lot of time reporting on greenwashing cases. And to be honest, a lot of that's coming from outside of Africa at the moment. It's not coming in Africa. But I do think African entities are very aware of those risks and are watching out for it. I'll hand you straight to Elias, who'll have a much more informed opinion.
Yeah, so I think that's an issue. And as Liz has mentioned, is not that highly within the continent. But also, if you look at the African continent, we are still at that particular verge of developing these products that would be green. There's need to think about labeling what would be a green instrument, what will not be a green instrument, what will be a blue instrument. So that there's still we are still at that particular component of creating these particular solutions. But that's where again regulations will be at the forefront, and most of the time then there'll be a conflicting issue, particularly within the continent, whereby there's need to look at this. Is it a strategical component or is a compliance issue? Because again, if companies will look at moving towards a low carbon and a more resilient, sustainable economy as a compliance issue, then we might miss the point as a continent. So I think the goal is ideally to look at this particular issue from a more strategic point of view, because these are some of the risks that will impact, is already impacting Africa. So the key thing is that we are looking at it from a very strategic standpoint. And that's why initiatives such as the Nairobi Declaration, initiatives such as whereby we are basically assisting regulators in Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya to develop an ESG guidance note and creating assessment tools for various organizations within the financial sector will lead the way in terms of really reducing these risks such as greenwashing and blue washing.
Thank you, Lars. So I think we've got about 4 minutes left. So it's unfortunately time for me to start the close of this session. If you have enjoyed it as much as I have, please can you complete a feedback survey using the QR code, which our event management team is sharing on your screen now. I think just to circle back to our original question, what does Africa need from COP27? I've been making a few notes as I've gone through the session today, and it feels like empathy, understanding, a united voice, collaboration, flexibility, financial support, action, commitment, not just words. But I think the most important thing is ambassadors, like the presenters we have today, and not just ambassadors, but actuarial ambassadors for Africa, for climate change and for sustainability. And with that, I just want to thank our panel for their thoughts, their expertise, and their words of inspiration. We really appreciate you. And I'd also like to thank the IFOA team behind the scenes, so Henry, Matthew, and Danielle, for ensuring today's event was a success. The next event in the series is Net Zero Investing, a Beginner's Guide, and that takes place on Tuesday, the 7th of December, and it will be led by the IFOA's Net Zero Portfolio Alignment Working Group. The event will be co-chaired by Brendan Horowitz and James Turner, with speakers from the Working Party. So please do register for the event now via the IFOA events page. So that concludes today's event. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for attending and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.